I hope you have been doing the meditations well. So it was mainly being aware of your thoughts and how the thoughts begin to affect the emotional excitement. It's the thoughts we think that begin to affect the emotions. Now this emotional excitement is not only something that will lead to different kinds of behavior which will affect society, it also begins to affect your own body and your health. And that is why it is called stress. The word stress refers to what happens to the body. It was a scientist was living in Canada who wrote the book on stress and began to talk about stress. His name was Hans Selye. And he called this problem the general adaptation syndrome. Now that means stress is not something that happens outside in the world. Stress is how you react to what is happening outside. So it is the disturbance that goes on inside your own body. And this disturbance he analyzed, and he spoke of this disturbance at 3 levels. What he called the alarm reaction, the stage of resistance, and the stage of exhaustion. So these 3 stages can ultimately even lead a person to death. The last stage, the stage of exhaustion. And he explains this. The second stage is the stage of resistance, where if we begin to resist or we do not accept what happened, like someone dies who is very close to us, and we are not ready to accept it. We don't want to accept that death. And that itself begins to cause problems inside. But if we can accept it, then we are not reacting to it emotionally. And even if it continues beyond that stage of existence, the whole body and the mind becomes exhausted. And as a result, you might either commit suicide or you might simply die. This is what he was trying to say. And this will be described to you in pictures and examples by Billy now. And so you can listen to it and see it with your eyes so that it will make you understand the importance of learning to change the way you think, to change the way you interpret your circumstances, and also change the way you gain control over the emotional excitement, how you can calm the mind. And that is what we call stress management. So now I'll let Billy continue. Huh? Okay.
So this evening we're going to take a look at stress, how it arises, and what are the consequences, and very quickly, what are some of the things that we can do to help ourselves not get so affected by stress. I'll just begin with this simple slide. Very often we ask ourselves, who am I? We really cannot say I am so and so as though we exist. Basically, we can only say I am an organism in an environment. Environment is basically everything that is happening that stimulate our senses, and as organisms in our environment, we then experience these stimulations and respond to it. The fact that we are alive is simply because of the process of metabolism in our body. And this process of metabolism in our body causes the cells to multiply. Strong cells survive and weak cells will die off. And if you have more weak cells than strong cells, you become sick. If you have more strong cells than weak cells, you become healthy. And that is basically how we can age and we experience illness until all the cells give up, and then you will experience the final moment, which is called death. So we are alive because of metabolism, and we can experience the environment through our consciousness because we are evolved with 5 physical senses. These 5 physical senses enable us to experience the environment by being able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. And environmental activities continuously stimulate our sense organs. And this stimulation arises and falls away continuously. For instance, when you're seeing something, you're not seeing something in a static manner. You're seeing something because light reflected from the object enters your eye, and this reflection of light from the object entering your eye is happening continuously. This continuous activity arises and falls away, arises and falls away, and stimulates the light-sensitive cells at the back of your eyeball in an area called the retina. And this stimulation is again something that arises and fall away, arises and fall away. So it's a continuous stimulation. All the sense organs that pick up environmental stimulations then send this information to the brain for processing. And this happens because we have a central nervous system which is made of two main parts, the brain and the spinal cord. The spinal cord is connected to the peripheral nervous system, which is in turn connected to all your sense organs. So the sense organs will have the nerves connected to it, like for example your eye. You will have optic nerves coming from the eyeball, going through this peripheral nervous system, entering the spinal cord and carrying information to the brain. And the brain processes the information and sends out signals and sends out instructions to the rest of the body to react. So basically this is how the central nervous system works in a nutshell. Picking up environmental stimulations, sending it to the brain for processing, and the brain will react and send instructions and signals to the rest of the body to react. And we saw this yesterday. Basically, the brain is made of three main layers. The oldest is called the brain stem, which manages our autonomic function that keeps us alive. That's why it's called the survival brain. The important one are the other two. The one in the middle is limbic system, and that is the part of the brain that is responsible for triggering various hormonal changes in the body, biochemical changes in the body, and that can lead to various conditions in the body. It can lead to your well-being if the hormones being released are some of the good hormones, or it can lead to sickness and even death if the hormones being released are some of the harmful hormones. Then the outermost layer is this cerebral cortex. This is the thinking brain. We also call this the learning brain. Learning because it is able to remember. So you can actually remember something that you have perceived. You can remember an experience. You can remember the consequence of your actions. And if you remember consequences of actions and you use it to make future judgment for your own well-being, then you are managing your thinking in a positive way. But if you allow the unconscious memory to arise, you allow the unconscious part of your brain to react, and you don't think, you don't use your rational thinking and good judgment to make good decisions, then that could lead to your demise. It could lead to stress. So we'll take a look at how stress arises. Now the Buddha described in various sutras that the mind is made of, the mind, what we call mind, is actually three parts of mental experiences. The first part of mental experience is called vijnana. This arises with the panchakanda, what we commonly translate as five aggregate. But the Bhante Punnaji translated as the process of perception. The five constituents of the process of perception. So vijnana is actually what is perceived through the sense organs as a result of the process of perception. And with vijnana, mano arises to process this perception by referring it to categorized memory and interpreting the perception by giving meaning to what was perceived. This meaning can be good meaning. This meaning can also be harmful if it is drawing on different parts of your memory to interpret what was experienced. At the same time, with the panchakanda, the five aggregates, the feeling part of this five constituents will trigger the arising of chitta, which is the emotional mind. commonly called the emotional mind. Scientifically, it's called the affective process. The thinking mind, scientifically, is called the cognitive process, because cognitive process produces cognition, thoughts that interpret what was perceived. Affective process produces affection, which is a kind of feeling, emotional feeling. Now, we have to be very careful of the word feeling. There are two references to the word feeling. One reference is actually in the 5 constituents of process of perception, or the 5 aggregates. That feeling is the raw feeling of something you have just perceived. The sensation of what you have seen with your eyes, or the sensation of what you have touched with your body, or what you heard with your ears. And there is a feeling which is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. That feeling is not an emotional feeling. But when this information goes to the brain for processing, the activity of the brain and the body is what we call mind. So the chitta part of this processing will then produce an emotional feeling, and that is commonly what we understand as feeling. So the feeling produced by chitta is not the same as what is found in the process of perception. In this presentation, I will qualify each time I mention the word feeling. I will say it's either an emotional feeling or it is a sensory feeling or sensational feeling, which means it's something you have just sensed and the feeling is either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This pleasant or unpleasant or neutral feeling is not something that is processed by the mind, in the sense that it is not the result of processing in the mind. It is the result of evolution of your central nervous system. For instance, red light produces an uncomfortable feeling in your optic nerves going through your central nervous system. And this is because of evolution. So this is how this feeling, sensory feeling or sensation feeling, comes about as a result of evolution. So let's take a look at the process of experience, and this time I will go in a bit more detail compared to yesterday, so now you have to pay attention. Environmental activities will stimulate our sense organs: the eye, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body. Light entering the eyeball, stimulating the back of the eyeball at an area called the retina, will lead to the ability to see. Sound waves are actually basically vibrations in the air that enter the ear and strike the eardrum, causing vibrations on the eardrum, which then in turn triggers 3 tiny little bones, and they lead to a vibration of a part of the inner ear called the cochlea that can then transmit these vibrations to the brain, and the brain interprets it as sound. In the case of nose and the tongue, it is because of chemicals. In the case of nose, it is odorant chemicals released by the food or whatever item which is smelly. This odorant chemical then bind with certain receptors in your olfactory bulb deep inside your nose, and that stimulates the olfactory bulb and sends the signal to the brain. The same with tongue. It is flavor molecules reacting chemically with receptors in your taste buds, and this reaction of the receptors in your taste bud will send the signal to the brain, which is then interpreted as taste, whether it is salty, sweet, and so on. In the case of the body, there are several different types of receptors under your skin. It senses vibration, it senses temperature, and it can also react to the molecules in a chemical, reacting in a chemically to molecules, and that causes a sense of touch. So this is really what happens, and these stimulations then trigger Panchakanda, which is the 5 constituents of the process of perception, commonly translated as the 5 aggregates. And with these 5 constituents, it is a continuously happening thing. It is not like, it is stimulated and then you get vijnana and that's it. It is continuously happening. As light enters your eye, it is continuously stimulating the retina, and the light-sensitive cells in the retina will send the signal to the brain, and this happens continuously. It arises, falls away, arises, falls away. So it produces vijnana in a continuous manner. It is not a static thing. Vijnana is best translated as perception. Now, some of you may be aware that the conventional translation by many other authors would call sanya as perception. But actually the word perception is not very accurate to translate sanya. Because sanya, at the time of sanya, which is a sensation of this stimulation, there is no perception of what happens out in the environment. Because sanya is a very low-level activity. It's a sensation, sensing stimulations from the environment. Together with this stimulation, there is feeling. This is the sensory feeling, Vedana. This is not the emotional feeling. And then this Vedana Sanya pair works continuously, billions and billions per second. And they are then constructed to form a big picture, continuously forming this big picture called vijnana. This forming of big picture is the result of construction, sankhara, mental construction. Specifically, it's called the chitta sankhara because it constructs Vedana and Sanya to produce vijnana continuously, billions and billions of times every second. And then vijnana arises, and this arising is what is commonly called mind, or the first part of the mind. The first part of the mental experience, which is commonly called mind. Mind is not a good word because it's such a big word, because there are really 3 parts of the mental experience. And vijnana is just the first part, related to sense organs and environmental stimulation. With the rising of this panchakanda, you're able to then see, hear, smell, taste and touch. Because the sanya in the panchakanda leads to the arising of mano. Mano is the cognitive process whereby it takes the perception and then refers to memory of past experiences. This memory of past experiences is a very fluid memory, and it is all categorized. And then it tries to interpret this perception and give meaning to it. The meaning given to it is called Dhamma, with a small d. And the scientific term is called recognition. Or more precisely, it is called recognition. And this process of recognition is called papancha. How it is able to translate perception into a meaningful mental image. At the same time, with this panchakanda, the feeling part, the Vedana, which is the sensory feeling, not the emotional feeling, but the sensory feeling, then is experienced as something pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And this sensory feeling leads to the arising of chitta, which is the affective process of mind. So this is the third part of your mental experience. So there are 3 parts of mental experience: vijnana, mano, and chitta. Unfortunately, in all the Buddhist texts that you find, almost all of them, they do not differentiate what is mano, what is chitta. Every time mano or chitta is mentioned in the Pali Canon, most translators simply translate it as mind. So when you read sutras and it says the word mind, do be a little bit careful. Be a little bit mindful. Look up the Pali Sutra, Pali version, and see whether it is saying chitta or mano, because the meaning and the implications are quite different. Mano refers to your ability to think rationally. And this helps you to become intelligent. That's why mano is also sometimes called the intellect. Whereas chitta is the unconscious part of your mind, which is aroused by feeling from the panchakanda. And pleasant or unpleasant or neutral feeling will trigger different reactions, different arousals in chitta. And it is these arousals of the chitta that leads to emotional excitement. When the chitta arises, it actually causes a biochemical chain reaction. This biochemical chain reaction causes the release of hormones, and they cause tension in the body. Tension in the body is a form of stressor. Stressor means conditions that stress the body. That's why it's called stressor. So these conditions causing tension in the body leads to the experience of stress. Now this is only the first part of stress experience. Stress experience is actually made of a number of components. It is not just simply the biochemical reactions. This is just the first part, and it causes the feeling of stress. The Pali word for the feeling of stress is dukkha, physical stress, physical pain. So dukkha in this case here, I'm not talking about dukkha in general, referring to what is commonly called suffering as a whole, but this word dukkha here specifically refers to physical stress or physical pain, the physical part of stress. And this is what leads to the whole thing called emotion. Emotion is a fairly big word. It is not just one thing. It starts with this biochemical reaction and it leads to other things. So emotion is more than just this biochemical reaction. It is what happens next. So what happens next? This part of dukkha is actually commonly called the physical stress. This is the physiological disturbance. And it leads to grief and lamentation. This is actually an alarm reaction. Bhante mentioned the scientist Hans Selye. Hans Selye actually wrote about how stress can be categorized into 3 stages. And he calls these 3 stages the general adaptation syndrome. The first stage is called alarm reaction. And what Hans Selye refers to as alarm reaction corresponds to what the Buddha refers to as soka and parideva, which is commonly translated as grief and lamentation. This alarm reaction triggers the beginning of an emotional arousal and reaction. So emotional process begins from this point. So let's take a look at this biochemical reactions in the body which leads to this physical stress, dukkha, and this experience is called the fight or flight reaction.
Fear is so important for our survival, we do something absolutely remarkable. Our bodies begin to react to a threat before we're even consciously aware of what the threat might be. Because when we're faced with danger, milliseconds count. At the first hint of danger, early warning signals are sent to the brain via the optic nerve to our tiny and primitive fear center, the amygdala. This prepares our body for action. Next, nerve pulses are fired down the spinal cord to the adrenal glands near our kidneys. This triggers a release of adrenaline. Now we're on full alert. Adrenaline is the vital hormone that can flood our body in a split second. As it reaches our lungs, we breathe more deeply and take in more oxygen. It also makes our heart beat faster. Oxygen-rich blood is diverted to our muscles. They are now charged springs, waiting for the signal to run or fight. All this before our conscious mind has even registered a threat. This reaction to fear has evolved over millions of years and is known as the fight or flight response.
So this is the fight or flight reaction, which is the result of biochemical activities being released. And the part of the brain that triggers this is actually the amygdala. I mentioned yesterday. It's very important because amygdala is responsible for a lot of emotional arousal and reactions, right? Our excitement. So this fight or flight reaction, first, in the brain, the amygdala detects some kind of threat, and it sends a message through the sympathetic pathway. It is called the sympathetic pathway because it sympathizes with your circumstances. It sympathizes with what is going on in your environment in relation to your survival. Because it senses something that might be threatening, so it triggers various reactions to help you defend against these threats. One of the things it does is that it triggers the release of hormones from various glands. And one of the very important glands is the adrenal gland. We have two adrenal glands, one on each side, directly above your kidney. So the adrenal gland releases two very powerful hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. These hormones released under this fight or flight reaction can be very damaging to the body and can actually cause a lot of harmful effects that can lead to ill health. You can get sick. You may even die from it. People have died from it. Sudden heart attack, cardiac arrest, right? All this kind of excitement. So any kind of excitement, whether the excitement comes from a threat or the excitement comes from some sensual pleasures, it can actually cause various conditions. It can even lead to people dying. I remember when I was a young boy, those days people were really crazy about Thomas Cup during the days of Tan Hek Huang, Tan Hek Mong. For those of you who are old enough, you will know who I'm talking about. Gunalan, P. And these people actually, and Rudy Hartono, they were very exciting matches. And I remember as a young boy, quite a few elderly people watching it on television, in the moment of excitement, got a cardiac arrest and died on the spot, heart attack, because they got so excited. So it is not only because of threat that people can die. When people experience sensual pleasures, sensual experience, and they get very excited, that excitement can cause death. And that process, that I will mention that because Buddha also pointed out there are really 5 levels of suffering. I've already mentioned the first 2, Soka and Parideva. There are 3 more to come. So this adrenal gland releases these 2 powerful hormones that is carried throughout the body through your blood circulation and reaches different organs. Each different organ reacts in specific way to specific hormones. It causes the heart to beat faster and to pump more blood, increasing the blood circulation. At the same time, it causes blood pressure to rise. When cortisol reaches your lungs, it causes your respiration to deepen, to hasten, very rapid respiration, so that it increases oxygen intake. And this rapid respiration process can also lead to hyperventilation. Hyperventilation is when people are breathing very short breath in a very rapid way like that. That kind of thing. And that is not healthy. Right? And when it reaches your intestine, as I said yesterday, it suspends intestinal activity, digestion. Because digestion draws a lot of energy from the rest of your body. That's why after a heavy meal, when you attend Dharma talks, or you attend a business meeting after a heavy lunch, you get very sleepy. Because your digestive system is drawing a lot of energy from your brain. So your brain does not have enough energy to work, so you can't pay attention. Right? When your digestive system is suspended, all the enzymes and acids that are being released in your bowel system to help with the digestion then floods the bowel system and stays there. So they're very corrosive. They can cause worsening of your ulcers. They may even cause other diseases. And if this happens too much, they may even lead to other diseases, other illness that may even be very fatal. Colon cancer is one of the examples. When adrenaline reaches your muscle, it actually causes your muscle to tense up. So you have muscle tension. This is because it helps you to get ready to fight against the threat or to run away from the threat. This is why it's called fight or flight reaction. Actually, there are 3 Fs. Freeze, fight, or flight. Freeze is when you have never experienced that threat before. You have never seen, heard, smelled, tasted that particular kind of experience before. So it is the first time this kind of threat happens. It causes you to freeze up. For instance, when some lady driving a car and stop at the red light, and she leaves her handbag on the front passenger seat. A lot of ladies did that in the past. And you know what could happen. Some motorbike gang comes along, smash the window and grab your handbag. And then the person freezes. And this has happened to my wife. It has happened to quite a number of my colleagues. They freeze. They didn't know what to do. And so that is part of that reaction. Freeze, fight, or flight. And it causes other reactions. Hair standing on end, which is a evolutionary process to help you look bigger. Because if you think about these animals like cats and dogs, when their hair stand on end, it makes the animal looks bigger. Pupils dilate so that you're able to see more clearly, so that you're able to catch more light, enhancing your vision. Facial expression distorted because it makes you look more fierce to help you frighten away your potential predator. That's why when people are angry, they look fierce and their facial expression is distorted. And the same happens to people who are anxious, who are worried. The same happens to people who are depressed. The same happens to people who are feeling shameful. Any kind of emotions can cause this facial expression to be distorted. Right? A very famous scientist actually categorized these facial expressions to 7 kinds: happiness, sadness, disgust, and various others, anxiety, and so on. And it causes also perspiration, trembling, and body temperature rising. And the worst condition is it causes blood sugar level to rise rapidly. And this rising of blood sugar level is to help your body convert the stored energy stored in your fat, right, to convert it into active energy so that you can now fight against the threat or you run away from the threat. And then finally, it suspends your body immune system. Now you look at all these things. What happens when your body immune system is suspended? You become susceptible to various diseases and various virus and bacteria floating in the air. You get sick very easily from any kind of bacteria in the air when your immune system is shut down. What happens when your blood sugar level rises? It causes diabetes. You become diabetic over time. What happens? Oh, I thought someone's phone went off. What happens when your body perspires a lot? You lose a lot of water, so you get dehydration. What happens when facial expression distorts too much? You get a lot of railway tracks on your face. Right? You get all kinds of wrinkles on your face, premature wrinkling. What happens when pupils dilate too much? When your pupils dilate too frequently and too much, it weakens your eyesight. Right? What happens when your hair stands on end too often? Sooner or later, there's no more hair to stand on end. You lose your hair. What happens when your muscles get tensed up too much? You get neck ache lah, back ache lah, shoulder ache lah, muscle cramp lah, all kinds of aches. What happens when your intestinal movement, digestive system is suspended too often? Well, the acids and the enzymes flooding your bowel system can cause a lot of damage. Right? They are corrosive. They can cause damage to the wall of your bowel system. They can worsen any ulcer condition you may have. Right? What happens when respiration deepens too much? Right? People can actually become asthmatic. Right? You can actually end up with a condition called asthma. And what happens when the heart beats too fast and blood pressure rises? You get hypertension. Yeah, you get high blood pressure. And heart beating too fast, too often. Well, scientists have pointed out that the heart is capable of beating only so many billion times per lifetime. So what happens when it beats too fast, too often? It shortens your life. Simple as that. So you can see all these very harmful effects of stress. Now let's take a look at how it leads to emotional reaction. We spoke about earlier on, the biochemical reactions in the body leads to this physical experience of physical stress. And that red arrow you see there is actually the sensation, bodily sensation coming from this condition I have just described here. All these conditions lead to this bodily sensation shown with the red arrow there. The feeling in the body. And emotions are made of two dimensions really. What are the two dimensions? One is the physiological part, physical part. So emotion starts off with this physical part, physiological part, which is the hormonal disruption in your body, causing various bodily sensations and bodily reactions. Then comes the psychological part next. Now, until about 120 years ago, many scientists used to think emotion is only something mental. Then they didn't realize that it was actually associated with hormones and physical. It started with something physical. So now, because of the work of Hans Selye, people recognize that emotion begins with something physical, physiological, then leads to mental. Emotions have two major categories of activities. First, it is arousal and excitement. This arousal and excitement will then lead to reaction. So this arousal and excitement causes the mind to make certain decisions, the chitta, to make certain decisions, to react in certain way. But this arousal and excitement can also lead to unconscious reaction from your past programming, from your upbringing. You may react in a certain way. When maybe someone calls you by a nickname that you don't like, you react by shouting back at that person. So every time you hear someone mention that nickname that you don't like, you shout back. So that is an unconscious reaction, even before you have time to think about it. So these are the two activities of emotions. Now the first dimension of emotion is the physiological part, which is commonly called stress, and the word dukkha here is referring to this physical part of emotion. Right. Then comes the arising of your memory, imagination, expectation, when chitta arises. Every time chitta arises, it triggers the arising of memory, imagination, expectation. And from there, this is the psychological arousal. And it leads to what is commonly called emotional excitement. From this arousal, you now have emotional excitement. And this arousal and emotional excitement is called domanassa, or distress. So stress is the physical part, distress is the mental part. This mental part, the emotional excitement, disturbs your mano. So the chitta's activity of emotional excitement disturbs your rational thinking, your intellectual thinking, your judgment. You're not able to think clearly, right? So your thinking process is disturbed. Your judgment is disturbed. You're not able to make good judgment because of this disturbance from emotional excitement. And it leads to a condition whereby emotional feeling, now the feeling here is your emotional feeling. The feeling of this bodily sensation of the red arrow, of this red arrow here, your bodily sensation, and also the feeling of this mental experience disturbing your rational thinking, then this is an emotional feeling. This emotional feeling is disturbing your thinking, your rational thinking. So there is a tug of war going on in the brain between the limbic system and the cerebral cortex. I'll show you a video in a moment, but let's move on a little bit. So this physical stress, Buddha calls it, and this is the third level of suffering, Buddha calls it dukkha, referring to the physical stress, physical pain. Then this emotional, the mental part, distress, is domanassa. Sometimes it's translated as depression. Well, it leads to depression. If it is not checked, that means if it is not prevented from worsening, if it is allowed to go on unconsciously, it leads to depression. So now you have the third and the fourth part of suffering, dukkha and domanassa, in addition to sokha and parideva. This is what Hans Selye refers to as the stage 2 of general adaptation syndrome. It is called the stage of resistance. This is the time when you begin to want to react. That's why it's called resistance. You want to do something about it. You want to react. And this reaction can be consciously or unconsciously arising. Let's take a look at this tug of war between emotional feeling and rational thinking.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, tug!
And when we try to control them, we start a tug of war between our brain's oldest and newest parts. While ancient structures like the amygdala respond to threats by trying to turn our anger or fear on, it's newer structures, such as the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain, that tried to turn them off. It's the tug of war between these two systems that gives rise to our emotions. At New York University, neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux has studied how the amygdala and the cortex shape our emotional responses. You know more about the amygdala than anybody alive, and you still can't control yours.
No.
Why?
Now, there's an interesting thing, again, that has to do with the wiring of the brain. This is, if we could just look at it here. So this is the human brain inside a skull. And the prefrontal cortex is here in the front, right behind your forehead. And that is the newest part of the brain. This is where we make our decisions. This is where we plan for the future and strategize. The lateral prefrontal cortex has no connectivity with the amygdala. The amygdala has superhighways to talk to the cortex, but the prefrontal cortex has only back roads and side streets to get to the amygdala. And therefore, it is unable to tell the amygdala, cool it.
But why are there no connections?
We're in the process of evolving as we speak, and those connections have not been put in yet. This thing was built to do fancy things cognitively, not necessarily to control our emotions.
Because of the way our brain has evolved, the connections from the amygdala, which is easily aroused by activities in the environment, triggering all this emotional arousal and excitement. The connections from your amygdala are very strong going to your thinking brain, up the front here, the cerebral cortex, and the frontal lobe, where you make decisions and judgment. So the connections are very strong. So when the amygdala is aroused, it sends a lot of signals, disturbing signals to your thinking brain, sabotaging the thinking process. So all these disturbing signals, interfering signals coming from the amygdala is disturbing your ability to think. This connection is so strong, it actually continuously disturbs your rational thinking, and this is why judgment is never good when you get emotionally excited. You cannot make good judgment call. At the same time, the thinking brain has very weak connections going back to the amygdala. So the thinking brain, the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex, that part which makes all the decision, is unable to actually tell the amygdala, cool it, calm down. It can't. It does not have strong enough connections for that. And because of that, you're not able to tame your emotion normally without proper mind training or mental training. One of the best mental training for this is meditation. Meditation helps you do two things. First, to tame the arousal of the amygdala, to tame your emotions, to tame the activity of the chitta. And secondly, to train and sharpen your prefrontal cortex, your thinking brain, your mano, your ability to think rationally and think clearly. So meditation helps you in these two ways. Now this pulling in opposite direction between thinking and feeling, the psychological term is called cognitive dissonance. In fact, this is a very precise translation of the word vicikiccha. Vicikiccha is often translated as skeptical doubt, but actually it is not just skeptical doubt. It leads to skeptical doubt, but it actually begins as cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance means your thinking and your feeling are pulling in opposite directions. That means in your mind, there are two different sets of thoughts pulling in opposite direction. One is an emotional thought, the other one is a rational thought. So feeling and reasoning pulling in opposite direction, the emotional thought pulling in one direction because of your chitta, and the rational thinking, reasoning or intellect is pulling in the other direction because of your mano. So mano and chitta are having a tug of war going on. That's why it's called cognitive dissonance. Dissonance means they are not in agreement, they are not in harmony, they are working in opposite directions, working against each other. This is very common. When feelings and reasoning pull in opposite directions, and one experiences this cognitive dissonance, vicikiccha, one invariably reacts according to feeling. Now, when we make decisions, 99% of the time, you make decisions because of feelings. Think about the last time you bought a mobile phone. Think about the last time you bought a car. Did you go through the whole process of evaluating all the different models and all the technical specifications of every single model, comparing one spec against another, one by one, and finally arriving at a conclusion which particular choice is the best value for money? People don't do that. They decide what brand or what model or what features they like. Yeah, they like. Like is emotion. And then they make a decision. Now, human beings are very very wise. They use their intellect in the wrong way. They make decisions with their emotions, and then they use their intellect to justify emotionally charged decision with clever reasoning. That's what we do a lot of the time. Yeah? And this clever reasoning is called justification. We're very good at that. So we apply our intellect. Under normal circumstances, we use our intelligence to justify all our emotional decisions. Now, we've come to this point where you have stress and distress, the physical part of your emotion, and the psychological, mental part of your emotion. And with emotional excitement disturbing your rational thinking and reasoning, if you do not stop this disturbance in time, if you do not learn how to relax the body and calm your mind and allow this to go on unconsciously, what will happen? It will disturb your rational thinking, and because of your rational thinking being disturbed, the way you interpret your circumstances will be affected. You will be interpreting your circumstances in a very emotional way because the amygdala is very powerful. It is disturbing your mano, you're disturbing your cerebral cortex. So chitta is disturbing the mano. And if you allow that to continue, it actually triggers more biochemical reaction. It causes more hormonal disruption in your body. Now, if you allow that to go on, it goes in a vicious cycle. More biochemical reactions in your body causes your mind to become more stressed, and it gets worse and worse and worse. It is called amygdala hijack. And if it continues, it leads to a condition called post-traumatic stress disorder. First, you experience some kind of a trauma, simple trauma. But that trauma leads to more confused thinking, and that leads to releasing more hormones, and that trauma continues. That's why it's called post-traumatic disorder. All right? So that actually can lead people to very severe situations, leading people to deep depression, may even have suicidal thoughts. People may want to commit suicide because of that. And also, this may even trigger things like heart attack, cardiac arrest, and people can die instantly. Hans Selye described this as stage 3 of general adaptation syndrome. He calls it the stage of exhaustion. Buddha has also pointed out this is called upayasa, which is commonly translated as expiration or exhaustion. So it can either lead to suicidal thoughts, or it can even lead to actually dying from a cardiac arrest. So this is how bad it can get, this emotional hijack, or the amygdala hijack. Now, emotional reactions. The word tanha actually is emotional reaction. It's commonly translated as craving. Craving does not do justice to the meaning of tanha, because tanha is actually referring to your emotional reaction, which comes in three stages or 3 phases. 3 types of this reaction. When you experience pleasant sensations, then you have a reaction called lobha. Lobha is the lust and greed for pleasures, for sensual pleasures. You want more of something that is pleasurable. Wanting more of what is pleasurable leads to what is called, leads to this attitude called kama tanha. Kama here is referring to sensual desires. So it is a reaction of wanting more of these sensual desires. If the sensation is neutral, then it leads to the delusion of existence, the delusion that there is a self to be affected. Because when you experience something that has neutral sensations, you begin to think there is something out there. I don't know what it is, but there is something out there. Now, if there is something out there, then there must be something in here. And that something in here is the self. The something out there is the world out there. So it leads to this delusion of existence that I have a self and there is a world out there. And this is moha. This condition is called moha. It leads to an attitude called bhava tanha. Bhava is the desire for existence. Bhava tanha means may it continue to exist. May whatever you have experienced, you allow it to continue to exist. So that is bhava tanha. When you experience unpleasant sensations, it leads to a condition called dosa. Dosa is when you want to avoid this unpleasant sensation or displeasure. Or in some cases, if this displeasure is strong, you may feel hatred towards the displeasure. So it is aversion or hatred towards something that is unpleasant. That is dosa. With dosa, it leads to an attitude of vibhava tanha. Vibhava tanha is the opposite of bhava tanha. Bhava tanha is may it continue to exist. It is the attitude of saying may it continue to exist. That is bhava tanha. Vibhava tanha is the opposite. May it not exist. May it stop. You want the displeasure to stop right away. You don't want it to exist. You don't want it to continue. So that is vibhava tanha. So you can see tanha is really an emotional reaction, not just craving as it is commonly translated. So using the word emotional reaction is more precise to describe what is happening with tanha, the experience of tanha. So let's take a look at lobha, lust or greed. Here it is actually a clinical experiment in the laboratory where people are being shown sexually implicit images arousing them. You have emotional excitement, right, arousing your sexual desires.
In Seattle, Washington, scientists are attempting to map the exact neural architecture of human sexuality. Dr. Ken Maravilla investigates how lust and sexuality affect each part of the human brain. He uses two technologies. One is the MRI machine. The other technology is a simple DVD player.
Our subjects are presented a stimulus that consists of sexually explicit scenes that promote their ability to become aroused in the magnet.
The experiment is simple. Subjects are shown neutral videos to get a baseline. Then, images become more sexually explicit for several minutes, while Maravilla and his staff voyeuristically watch as the subjects' brains change.
We have areas in the frontal lobes that are associated with reward and pleasant feelings, and these become active with arousal. The amygdala often becomes activated, and this is one of the decision-making, evaluative areas of the brain.
The MRI shows that as subjects are sexually aroused, there is an intriguing corollary to the new findings.
We also found that certain areas of the brain seem to become less active, and there appear to be areas that are related to moral judgment, of inhibition, if you will.
When the lust areas of the brain light up, the judgment areas of the brain begin to turn off. The Conclusion? The more aroused a person, the less access they have to clear judgment. It would seem that science shows a direct connection between lust and poor judgment. The theory supports the basic premise of sociologists studying this area of human behavior.
Sins are good, they're adaptive. Sexual desire is normal and appropriate and healthy. Lust is a term we give when there's too much of it or it's inappropriate.
When lust is aroused, judgment is turned off. The more aroused you are, the less you have access to clear judgment. This is because the amygdala is sending so many sabotaging signals to your cerebral cortex, to your prefrontal cortex, which is doing all the judgment. And that is sabotaging your ability to form good judgment. You can't control that. You have to train your mind to reduce this emotional excitement, reduce this arousal. Once the emotional excitement arises, you can't stop it. It disturbs your thinking. You no longer have access to clear judgment to stop it. So you need preventive measures. Training yourself by practicing meditation will help tremendously. Makes your mind able to be more calm, able to see things, how they arise, and able to then control your emotional excitement. When you are able to control your emotional excitement, you become less affected by these conditions here. So therefore, you must nip it at the bud. Control your emotional excitement and your arousal. So that was lobha. Let's take a look at dosa. Dosa is actually aversion. It can lead to hatred if that particular condition of unpleasant or displeasures is very strong. This example here is a young man who has certain mental problems. And he then started to live with his mother. Now, because of his strange behavior, his mother couldn't stand it anymore and one day told him to leave the house and go and stay on his own. When the mother told him that, he could not take it. His mind snapped and he started hammering his mother's head with a sharp object until he killed her. And here the scientists will explain why he did that and what really happened or what they think happened in his brain.
Today, scientists are beginning to examine exactly where anger comes from.
The brain perceives a lot of information, both from the outside world and from inside the body. And there is one part of the brain called the amygdala that serves the function of sifting through all that information and asking one question. Is this a threat? Is this something I should worry about?
Dr. Reuben Gur has zeroed in on the amygdala as the key instigator of anger. This walnut-sized lobe can quickly overwhelm the brain with uncontrollable rage.
Once there is a perception of danger, there is a cascade of responses in the body that includes changes in heart rate, in blood pressure, in sweating. It makes your body ready to fight or flee.
The amygdala is a primitive part of the brain. It exists because the human brain is made up of layers that were added on top of each other over the millions of years of evolution.
All those other older brains are still alive and well inside your own brain. So you have a part of you that thinks like a dog, and you have a part of you that thinks like a crocodile, and a part of you that thinks like a monkey.
The amygdala creates an automatic fight or flight response to threats. But human beings have evolved another part of the brain, the frontal lobes.
This area that you can see here in the front is the orbital frontal region. And the orbital frontal regions are like brakes for the amygdala. If you can think of the amygdala as being the engine for the threat response, the orbital frontal is the brakes.
If Dr. Gurr is correct, then a person who is overwhelmed by anger is literally, temporarily insane, until his amygdala can be controlled. Case in point, the 2003 murder of Betty Dodge by her son James Essick. At the time of the crime, Essick was an adult with mental problems, who had moved in with his mother. Their relationship deteriorated so badly that Dodge asked her son to move out.
And that set him into a panic. And he grabbed a sculpture that they had and broke it on her head and kept hitting her repeatedly until she was dead. And then he went across the street, turned himself into the police.
During the court case, Dr. Gurr was hired as an expert witness and asked to evaluate the mental capacity of Essick. He did a complete neuroscan of his brain and found that 30 to 40% of the tissue was missing in the orbital frontal area.
So when the amygdala was saying, I'm in danger, I'm furious, attack, there was not enough tissue in the front to say, calm down. You have better ways of dealing with this situation than attacking what you think is the source of your fear and anger.
The jury agreed with Dr. Gurr's testimony and ruled that James Essick was innocent by reason of insanity. He was sent to a mental hospital for treatment. Some might say James Essick was incapable of controlling his ability to sin.
The organ of our mind and what controls our behavior is the brain, and his brain is damaged.
But by the time an angry act results in prison or a mental hospital, the damage is done. Is there a way to treat human rage before it gets to this critical breaking point?
So they discovered that a part of his frontal lobe was damaged, where he was missing quite a lot of the tissue. So he was not able to make clear judgment as a result. And that's why he reacted in that manner. But you saw inside there that the scientists have mentioned, there is a part of us that think like a crocodile, there is a part of us that think like a dog, and there's a part of us that think like a monkey. So there are all these defilements that have been evolved through evolution as well as through our upbringing, and these can arise unconsciously as part of the arising of these unconscious thoughts. Right? So when these unconscious thoughts arise, if we are not aware of them, we can't control them, and the unconscious arising will be allowed to go on. And if these unconscious arising go on, they actually can help lead us to behave in very unwholesome way. But if we learn to become conscious and aware of any of arising of this nature, whenever the mind begins to have these thoughts arising, unwholesome thoughts arising, and we become aware and conscious, the fact that you are conscious of it, it cannot go on unconsciously anymore. Once you become conscious of it, you can do something about it. It is when you are not conscious of it that it can hurt you and harm you in many ways. So the important thing to learn to do is to learn to be conscious of it. And one of the important process of meditation that can help you do that is the Satipatthana. What is commonly translated as the 4 foundations of mindfulness. But actually, Bhante Punnaji translated it more precisely as the 4 constituents, right, of personality. Right? So, there is an ancient Sanskrit shloka used during the time, in ancient times, even predated the time of Buddha. It was used by parents to teach their children how to behave. Because as you have heard, there's a part of us that behave like a monkey, that behave like a crocodile, behave like a dog. So we have to be aware of these things and learn how to think rationally when we make decisions and when we want to behave in a certain way. So it basically says, taking food, sleeping, avoiding dangers, sexual activities, these acts are common between animals and humans. In other words, all animals and all humans, they basically do these things to survive and to propagate, right? To pass on their genes to the next generation. Ability to think is what makes humans different. Without thinking, humans are just like animals. That means we must be able to exercise our rational thinking, our logical thinking, our intellect, so that we are able to make good judgment call, make good judgment decisions, and manage our behavior in a positive and wholesome way. If we don't do that, we are just like animals. So when we have this physical stress and mental distress going on, and the chittas arising disturbs the mano, we may be making unwholesome decisions because of lust and greed for sensual pleasures, because of aversion and hatred for pain and displeasures, and because of the delusion of the self. So this decision making is called cetana, or what is more precisely translated as volition. Some people call it intention. That's also okay. So basically it is volition, cetana. And volition is basically the thought of wanting to do something, the decision or the intention to do something. And then it leads us to want more of gain and less of losses, more of fame, less of ill fame, more of praise, less of blame, more of pleasures, less of pain. And these are the 8 worldly conditions that the Buddha spoke about in the Lokavipatti Sutta in Anguttara Nikaya 8.6. So this volition then leads to the action, the manifestation of volition in action, that is called karma. So karma is actually referring to the action part. And these can be unskillful action. And this unskillful action could lead to consequences. And consequences is vipaka. So cetana is the volition or intention. Karma is the manifestation of that intention into action. So karma is the actual action, the physical action. And the consequence as a result of the action is vipaka. There are 2 kinds of vipaka, internal and external. Internal consequences arise at different levels, and Hans Selye has described this in his General Adaptation Syndrome when he explained stress. He calls it, I mentioned earlier already, alarm reaction, stage of resistance, and stage of exhaustion. These are internal consequences. It causes damage to your body. It causes you to do unwholesome things. It may cause you to destroy your own life. And Buddha mentioned also, Soka Parideva, they correspond to the alarm reaction stage. Dukkha and domanassa, physical pain and emotional pain, distress, depression. So dukkha, domanassa, they correspond to the stage of resistance. And finally, upayasa, that corresponds to the stage of exhaustion. You could die from it. You could die in an instant as a result of cardiac arrest, or you might make decisions to kill yourself as a result of very deep depression with suicidal thoughts. These are internal consequences. There are also external consequences, external vipaka. And they include in relation to the opposite party, the person you are relating to, the person you are interacting with. It may cause you may be causing harm to that person. In relation to society, the people around you. In relation to the law of the land, you may do things that break the law. In relation to your environment, you may be doing things to set fire to your environment or destroy your environment or so on. In relation to matters arising after death, it could lead to where and how you are reborn. So these are external consequences. So when we have these conditions going on, what can we do about it? How can we overcome this? I'm not going to go into the full solution, but I'm going to refer to what Bhante spoke about this afternoon. He mentioned about Satipatthana. And the translation of the word Satipatthana is Sati means attention, Upa means within, Tana means to place or to position. So it is translated as to place attention within. That is really what Satipatthana is. And one word can describe that placing of attention within or introversion of attention. And that word is introspection. It comes from two root words, intro. Intro meaning turning inwards. Spection comes from the word inspection. Inspection means examining. Observing and examining. Right? So introspection. Unfortunately, this word Satipatthana in the West is translated as mindfulness. And the word mindfulness conjures various other different kinds of explanation. A lot of people think about mindfulness as being mindful of your environment, about what you see, hear, smell, taste and touch, and you pay attention to your senses and so on. But that is really not what Satipatthana is about. Satipatthana is about introspection, turning your attention inwards to examine various conditions inside, in the body and the mind. So what are we examining? Those four focuses of introspection. The first focus of introspection is called Kayanupassana. That is observing the physical manifestation of the reaction in the body as movements or tension in the body. And this is that physical pain, the dukkha or stress, physical stress. So observing how your body reacts, your heartbeat, your breathing rate, your body temperature, your trembling, all these things, examining the reactions in your body, the activity of the body. So that is Kayanupassana. The next is to observe that these reactions actually lead to some kind of feelings. And this is actually sensations of your bodily reaction. Whether it is feeling painful or not, whether it is feeling pleasant or not. So observing the manifestation as feelings in the body as a result of your bodily activity. Right? And this is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And the third focus is Chittanupassana. Okay, sorry, the second one, Vedananupassana, comes from the word Vedana. Vedana is the sensory feeling, right? Not the emotional feeling. You're not examining your emotional feeling. You're examining sensory feeling of the body. Now the first two are physical. Now comes the mental. The first two relates to the body. These next two relates to how the mind works. Your chitta first and your mano next. So Chittanupassana, that is very precise, examining your chitta, observing the manifestation in the form of emotional excitements or calmness or temperament. Right? Calmness of temperament or mood, your temperament, your emotional excitement, the level of emotional excitement. Chittanupassana. So that is to examine the effects of how the chitta is working. Then comes the fourth part, the fourth focus, Dhammanupassana. Observing the manifestation in the form of thoughts in the mind, which are interpretations of your circumstances based on the past, the present, and the future. Dhammanupassana. The word Dhamma here is actually referring to your experiences. The way you interpret your experiences and your circumstances. Dhammanupassana. And these are explained thoroughly in Bhante's Level 3 book. So if you read this Level 3 book at some point in time after the retreat, you will be able to find more explanations of this in there, the Satipatthana. Now, if you're able to do that, then you are able to make wholesome decisions. Your volition, your cetana become wholesome volition. And with wholesome volition, you are able to execute skillful action. And when you execute skillful action, it leads to positive, wholesome, and beneficial outcome, consequences, vipaka. So it helps you to lead to positive, wholesome cetana, skillful karma, and beneficial vipaka. And I'll finish off with this same slide. When faced with changing vicissitudes of life, vicissitudes of life simply means all the changing conditions surrounding you, your circumstances, the activity of the environment, various things that are happening around you. So when faced with changing vicissitudes of life, the insecurities of life, the uncertainties of life, if the mind can be kept undisturbed, undisturbed by what? Undisturbed by emotional excitements. If the mind can be kept undisturbed, free from worry, lust, and fear, these are arising from your lobha, dosa, moha. Free from worry, lust, and fear, this is the supreme bliss in the Mangala Sutta. And this is where you stand a chance of perfecting your mind to the level where you may become liberated from all forms of suffering. And that liberation is what Bhante described as akupa ceta vimutti. Akupa ceto vimutti. Ceto is referring to chitta. Vimutti is liberation or emancipation. It is the emancipation of your chitta. That you no longer allow your chitta to disturb and arouse and excite you. So with this, I end my presentation. Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you very much, Billy, for enlightening all of us here. And so, you have gained a lot of wisdom, and also you have understood the value of meditation. And you have gained a lot of kusala karma. Let us share these merits with all departed relatives and all beings